Tonight, we're re-stepping into one of history's greatest mysteries, the hidden truth behind the fall of the Roman Empire. Most people think Rome collapsed in a single dramatic moment, but the reality is far stranger, slower, and more human than you might imagine. Before we dive in, if you love relaxing history stories that reveal the secrets behind the past, go ahead and tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to join our History community. And if you want more soothing journeys into forgotten worlds, make sure to check out the related videos waiting for you in the description now. Settle in, get comfortable, and let's uncover what truly brought the greatest empire on earth to its knees. The sun is setting over Rome, and everything feels soft and golden. The light slides over white marble streets, over quiet courtyards, and over rooftops that have seen centuries of triumph and trouble. It feels like the city is glowing from the inside, like a warm candle left on a table at the end of the day. People are closing their doors, shops are shutting their wooden windows, and the air settles into a peaceful kind of stillness. And for a moment, it almost feels like Rome will last forever. At least, that's what many people believed. After all, this was Rome's the heart of the biggest empire the world had ever seen. The place where armies marched from one edge of the continent to the other, where emperors ruled from golden thrones, and where the words Roman power once made whole nations very nervous. But tonight, as the city quiets down, there are little signs, tiny cracks that something is not right anymore. A merchant sighs as he counts his coins and finds that they don't stretch as far as they used to. A soldier finishes his duty shift but wonders if he'll still be paid on time this month. A baker locks his shop and hopes the grain shipment will come before his ovens go cold. These are small things, but they begin to add up. It wasn't like Rome woke up one morning and said, "Oh no, we're collapsing today." No empire works like that. Instead, Rome faded slowly, over many years, like embers that glow a little weaker every night. At first, nobody notices. Then suddenly, the fire that once lit the world is just gone. So tonight, under the soft Roman twilight, we begin a story not about battles alone, not about heroes or villains, but about the quiet truth behind the slow fall of a giant. Because the fall of Rome isn't just one event, it's a puzzle, a mystery. And to understand it, we need to take a slow walk through the city as day turns to night. Picture this, a group of old men sitting beside a fountain, arguing about politics like they've done for the last 50 years. The fountain is cracked, the water pressure is weak. One of the old men jokes that even the fountains are tired of holding up the empire. They all laugh, but the humor has a shiver of truth. Across the street, an official scrolls through announcements from the emperor, but these messages don't arrive as quickly anymore. Messengers are slow, roads are broken in some places, and some provinces are so far away that by the time news reaches them, there's already a new emperor on the throne. Rome feels eternal, but the world around it is changing faster than the empire can keep up with. The markets still buzz, but the buzz is softer. The military camp still stands, but the swords are not as sharp, and the soldiers not as disciplined. The Senate still debates, but its power is more ceremonial than real. On the surface, everything looks normal. Underneath, everything is quietly slipping. Think of Rome as a huge statue, beautiful, grand, admired by everyone, but one that's been standing for so long that the inside is hollow. The outside looks strong, the inside is creaking, and people are beginning to notice. As the last colors of sunset fade, lanterns flicker on, shadows stretch across the forum, temples glow in the firelight, and the streets feel like a warm whisper. It is a peaceful scene, almost dreamlike. But even in this calm moment, there are hints of storm clouds gathering far away. A traveler passes through the city gates, dusty from a long journey across the empire. He tells strange stories, tribes moving across borders, armies shifting, provinces becoming restless. People listen, but they shrugged. Rome has survived everything before. Why worry now? But the traveler shakes his head. The world is changing, he says, faster than Rome can. Some laugh him off, some don't, but his words float in the night air like smoke. Now imagine standing on a hill overlooking Rome. The sky is dark blue, the stars are out, and the great city glows like a field of tiny fireflies. It's calm, peaceful, even magical, and yet you can almost feel it, a kind of tiredness, a weight pressing down on a civilization that has grown too big, too proud, and too stretched out. Rome is not falling tonight, not tomorrow, not even next year, but the roots of the fall, the quiet beginnings are already here. hidden beneath the calm. And this is what makes the story of Rome's decline so fascinating. It wasn't only about being invaded. It wasn't just politics or economics or military trouble. Those are the surface level answers. But the hidden truth is deeper. Rome fell because the world shifted, and Rome didn't shift with it. It grew older, slower, and heavier, while everything around it sped ahead. Imagine a giant trying to run while carrying too much weight on his back. He begins steady, then a bit slower, and eventually he can barely move. That was Rome, not destroyed by a single blow, but worn down by thousands of small ones. As the night grows darker, a gentle breeze moves through the city. Curtains sway in villa windows, torches burn low, and far beyond Rome, in distant lands, forces are slowly gathering, forces Rome doesn't yet see, or chooses not to see. But those shadows on the horizon will soon matter. For now, though the city rests, Rome dreams of its victories, its grand days, its empire stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the deserts of Arabia. It dreams of its past, unaware that the future is creeping up behind it, step by step. Tonight is calm. Tomorrow will look the same. This is why almost no one realizes that the sunset they are watching is also the beginning of a long twilight. The empire isn't dying yet, but the daylight is fading, and the hidden truth behind its fall is just beginning to whisper. This is where our journey starts, in twilight, in quiet, and in the soft glow of a city that believes it is eternal. But as we move forward, chapter by chapter, we will peel back the layers and discover how those golden streets slowly dimmed, and why even the greatest empire in history could not escape the gentle pull of decline. Now, let's step deeper into the mystery. If you ever want to understand how Rome started to fall, you don't need to begin with battles or emperors. You only need to look at a map. The thing was huge, massive, ridiculously big. Honestly, it almost feels like the empire was playing some kind of ancient, collect all the land game and forgot to stop. Imagine stretching your arms as wide as you can, then stretching them another 1,000 miles, then another 1,000. That was Rome. From the hot sands of Egypt to the misty forests of Britain. From the Atlantic Ocean all the way to rivers so cold they probably made the soldiers rethink their career choices. And holding all of that together, well, that's where the trouble starts. Picture a Roman messenger riding across the empire. He has one job: deliver an important message from Rome to a general on the other side of the world. Sounds easy enough, except it takes weeks, sometimes months. He has to ride through deserts, mountains, forests, and areas where the roads are so rough, he probably questioned every life decision that led to this moment. By the time he reaches the general, the message might already be outdated. Maybe the emperor who wrote it isn't even emperor anymore. That happened more than once. Here's a message from Emperor Su, and never mind. Yeah, he's gone. Sorry. That's what happens when your empire is too big. News moves slowly. Orders move slowly. Fixing problems takes forever. Rome wasn't built in a day, but it also couldn't be managed in a day. Now, let's walk along the borders of the empire, those long, winding edges where Rome meets the rest of the world. At first glance, these borders look strong. There are walls, forts, guards, watchtowers. It all seems very secure. But if you zoom out, if you float above the empire like a bird, you start to see the problem. There are too many borders, thousands of miles of land to watch, mountain paths, rivers, open plains, forests so thick that soldiers could barely see. Every corner needed guards, supplies, food, weapons, officers, horses, and all of that had to be paid for. It's like trying to watch every door and window in a giant mansion with only a handful of people. You can try, but sooner or later, someone's going to sneak in while you're on a coffee break. Rome's enemies didn't always break through the borders because they were stronger. They broke through because Rome didn't have enough people or energy left to keep every spot guarded all the time. Even the strongest wall means nothing if there aren't enough people standing on top of it. Inside the empire, life looked peaceful. People slept safely at night, thinking Rome was protecting them from faraway dangers. But deep down, the empire was getting tired, very tired. Provinces, those faraway regions under Roman control, needed constant attention. They needed new roads, fresh soldiers, governors, food supplies, and money. Lots and lots of money. But Rome was running out of that money. Imagine trying to run a giant farm, a bakery, 3 workshops, and a small zoo all at once. By yourself, everything starts falling apart little by little. You fix one problem and 5 more show up. That was Rome managing its massive territory. When one province had trouble, say, a bad harvest, Rome had to send help. When another province had a rebellion, Rome had to send the army. When a third one needed money for repairs, guess who had to pay? Rome. Again, the empire was like a parent with 20 kids, all shouting, "I need something," at the same time, and Rome, with sweat on its forehead, was like, "Okay, line up, please." But here, as the real twist, some of those provinces were so far away they barely felt Roman anymore. Imagine living in a border town where the nearest Roman official shows up maybe once every 5 years. Do you still feel connected to the empire? Probably not. Little by little, these outer regions drifted. Not rebellions, not dramatic breakups, just emotional distance, like a long-distance relationship where neither side sends letters anymore. And the more provinces drifted, the heavier the whole empire felt. The farther Rome expanded, the more pieces it had to juggle. The more pieces it juggled, the more likely something would drop. Rome wasn't crushed by enemies first. It was crushed by the weight of holding everything together. One of the saddest parts, Rome knew the empire was too big. Some generals said it out loud. Some emperors whispered about it. A few even tried to shrink the borders. But shrinking an empire is like telling someone with a giant collection of souvenirs, "Maybe you don't need all of this." And the collector says, "But I found that seashell in Britannia, and that little statue in Egypt, and that shiny coin in Gaul." Rome was proud, maybe too proud. It didn't want to let go of its lands. Every province was a badge of honor, a trophy, proof that Rome had been unstoppable. So instead of letting go, Rome held on tighter, even as its arms grew weaker. As supply lines stretched too far, soldiers stationed at distant posts often went months without proper pay or food. Imagine guarding a cold frontier with a hungry stomach and no salary. The motivation wasn't great. Some soldiers grew lazy. Some looked for side jobs. Some even made deals with local tribes, unofficial ones, like, "You don't attack, and I don't bother guarding this part too hard." And the empire, already stretched thin, didn't know, or couldn't fix it, or sometimes didn't want to know, and the cracks were growing. Imagine a giant marble statue, towering and impressive. People admire it every day, but deep inside, tiny fractures form. You can't see them yet, not from the outside, but they're there. And one day, those little cracks will decide the statue's fate. Rome's borders were those cracks, too wide, too expensive, too hard to control. And every year, the cracks spread a little farther. As the chapter closes, picture the empire from above. Dark roads stretch like veins across the land. Forts dot the frontiers like tiny sparks. Cities glow softly under the moon. Everything looks peaceful. But if you listen closely, you can hear the empire sigh. A long, heavy sigh of a giant carrying too much weight on its shoulders. A sigh that says, "I can't hold this forever." Rome didn't fall yet, but it was slowing down, step by step, mile by mile, province by province. The twilight from chapter 1 stretches a bit darker now, and the real unraveling is only beginning. If Rome's huge borders were the heavy backpack on its shoulders, then its economy was the pair of old worn-out sandals on its feet. At first, they worked fine. They carried Rome across continents, over mountains, through deserts. But after centuries of use, those sandals were starting to fall apart. A ripped strap here, a worn sole there, a tiny hole that nobody fixes because A, it's still fine. But the thing about small holes, they don't stay small. And soon, the Roman Empire found itself walking into a silent storm, one made not of wind and rain, but of money problems. To understand this growing storm, imagine yourself standing in a busy Roman marketplace. The morning sun is rising. People are setting up their stalls, and merchants are shouting things like, "Fresh olives. Buy 2, get 1 slightly questionable lump for free. Warm bread. Still warm. Probably." Children run between baskets of fruit. Women bargain loudly, and the smell of grilled meat drifts through the air. It feels lively and rich. But if you zoom in, if you look closely at the coins being exchanged, the smile starts to fade. The coins don't look like they used to. Instead of being pure silver or gold, they're mixed with cheaper metals, bronze, copper, anything the government could get its hands on. The coins look the same on the outside, but they're worth less on the inside. This trick is called debasement. Rome didn't invent it. But wow, did they use it. It's basically the ancient version of saying, we don't have enough money, but what if we pretend we do? At first, people didn't notice, but soon, prices started creeping up. Bread cost more, oil cost more, even those slightly questionable olives cost more. Roman citizens looked at their thinning wallets and said things like, hold on, wasn't this cheaper yesterday? And the merchants nodded with sad eyes. Yes, but have you seen what the mint is doing to our coins? Inflation began to rise not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily, like water slowly filling a bathtub. At first, you don't worry. Then you look again and think, that's getting kinda high. Then you come back later and realize, oh no, it's overflowing. Rome was getting close to overflowing. And the big problem, the empire needed more money than ever. Managing huge armies, repairing long roads, governing dozens of provinces, feeding cities that depended on grain shipments from far away. The bill was enormous, but the economy wasn't keeping up. So taxes went up, then up again, then up even more, until farmers felt like the tax collectors were secretly training for the Olympics specifically. The marathon event where you run from door to door asking for money. Let's take a moment to talk about those farmers. In ancient Rome, farmers were the backbone of society. They grew wheat, olives, grapes, and all the good things that Romans loved. But as taxes grew heavier, farmers started to crack under the pressure. Some couldn't afford seeds, some couldn't pay workers, some gave up entirely and abandoned their land. An abandoned land meant abandoned food. An abandoned food meant the markets began to empty. Imagine walking into the marketplace from before and finding fewer stalls, fewer baskets of fruit, fewer smells drifting in the air. The storm was creeping in silently. A rich Roman official might not notice the change right away, but the common people felt it every day. Meanwhile, the wealthy elites of Rome were doing what many wealthy elites do best, enjoying life. Luxuries, fancy homes, fine clothing, banquets that lasted all night. Wealth began concentrating at the top, like cream rising to the surface. Except in this case, the cream kept rising until there was nothing left underneath. The economy grew unbalanced. The rich grew richer, the poor grew poorer, and the middle began to shrink like wool in hot water. This didn't destroy Rome instantly, but it made everything weaker, hollow, shaky. It created a world where some people feasted while others starved. And when an empire's foundation gets uneven, the whole building starts to tilt. Let's shift the scene for a moment. Imagine a Roman tax collector walking up a dusty road toward a small village. His sandals are new. His clothes are clean. He's humming a cheerful song. Nice morning, right? Now imagine the villagers watching him arrive. Nobody is humming. Because when that man appears, it usually means one thing. Someone is about to cry. Taxes were heavy, too heavy. And when people couldn't pay in coins, the government asked for payment in grain, animals, tools, or even labor. Farmers could barely keep enough for themselves. Some tried to run. Some hid in forests. Some sold everything they had. A few even became slaves to pay off their debts. In quiet little villages where life used to be simple and peaceful, the economic storm was blowing harder every year. And the government, well, it kept trying new solutions. Some were clever. Some were hopeful. Some were downright desperate. Price controls, new taxes, new coin types, more debasement, forceful grain collection, laws that locked people into their jobs so they couldn't leave. It was like watching someone plug holes in a boat with chewing gum. It slows the leak for a minute, sure, but eventually the water finds a way through. Cities suffered too. Rome, the mighty capital, depended heavily on shipments of grain, especially from Egypt. If those shipments were delayed or smaller than usual, the people felt it. Bread lines grew longer, tempers grew shorter, rumors spread faster than the wind. A government official might announce, everything is fine. Meanwhile, the baker down the street is whispering, buy bread today. Tomorrow, I might not have any. It was a slow, creeping anxiety. Not enough to cause riots immediately, but enough to make everyone feel uneasy. And here's the ironic twist. Rome's economy didn't collapse because people stopped working. It collapsed because the system around them stopped supporting that work. Too many taxes, too little trust, too much inflation, too many problems stacked on top of each other, like balancing a tower of clay pots. One pot slides just a little, and suddenly the whole stack is wobbling. By the time night falls on our scene, the Roman economy is still standing, still breathing, still functioning, but weak, very weak. Coins are duller, markets are smaller, farmers are struggling, soldiers are worried about their pay, and the empire's piggy bank is emptier than anyone wants to admit. The silent storm hasn't fully hit yet, but the winds are rising, and in the next chapter, those winds will blow even harder, because Rome's army, once the pride of the world, is about to face its own slow unraveling. The Roman army was once the pride of the ancient world. Imagine lines of soldiers marching in perfect formation, shields shining, sandals hitting the road in steady rhythm. These were the people who built an empire. They crossed mountains that looked impossible, deserts that felt endless, and rivers that probably made them say, "We're marching through that." Really, Rome's armies weren't just fighters, they were builders, engineers, peacekeepers, explorers. When they arrived somewhere, they didn't just conquer, they built roads, bridges, baths, entire towns. They brought Roman order wherever they went. For centuries, that army felt unstoppable. But as twilight settles deeper over the empire, something inside the army begins to change, quietly, slowly, almost gently, but definitely. Let's rewind a little, back to when Rome was younger and full of energy. In those days, the soldiers were Roman citizens, farmers, craftsmen, everyday people who felt proud to defend their homeland. They didn't fight for money. They fought for Rome, for their families, for their land, for that strange Roman thing called honor, which usually involved a lot of shouting, waving swords, and trying not to die. There was loyalty, brotherhood, identity. It was their soul. But as the empire grew too big, as borders stretched farther, and as the economy got weaker, fewer citizens volunteered to join the army. Think about it. If you were a farmer trying to survive heavy taxes and inflation, would you eagerly sign up for 20 years of marching and fighting? Probably not. And slowly, the Roman army began to change. Instead of citizens, Rome started hiring outsiders, foreigners, mercenaries, people who didn't grow up in Roman villages, or learn Roman stories, or feel that deep Roman pride. Many of these new soldiers were skilled, brave, hard-working, but they weren't Roman in their hearts. And here's the thing. Loyalty is different when it is tied to money instead of identity. If you're fighting because you love your homeland, you stay even when things get hard. But if you're fighting for gold, well, what happens when the gold runs out, or arrives late, or doesn't come at all? Rome was about to find out. Let's go to a Roman frontier fort maybe, along the cold rivers of the north, where the wind cuts through your clothes like a grumpy ghost. Soldiers huddle around fires, warming their hands. They wait for pay that is already late. They joke, but the jokes feel heavy. Did they forget about us? One soldier grumbles. Another shrugs. Wouldn't be the first time. The officers do their best to keep morale up, but even they know the truth. If the empire can't pay these men, they might walk away, or worse, switch sides. This wasn't a fantasy. It happened. More than once. When loyalty becomes something you can buy, you can also lose it. Meanwhile, back in Rome, officials talked proudly about their armies. We have troops everywhere. They'd say true, but they didn't mention the part where half of those troops barely spoke Latin, or where many felt more connected to their homelands than to Rome, or where entire units were made of different tribes who sometimes didn't even get along with each other. Imagine running a giant sports team where players come and go constantly. Nobody knows the team chant, and half the people on the field aren't sure which direction to run. That was the Roman military in its late years. Then came another problem: training. Old-school Roman soldiers trained like machines. Discipline was everything. You don't break formation, even if someone is screaming in your face. You don't drop your shield because it's heavy. You don't nap under a tree when you're supposed to be patrolling, even though, honestly, that tree looks extremely comfortable. But the new recruits, some were well-trained, some weren't. Some followed Roman rules. Others followed their own traditions. Some officers didn't know how to unify them. And training costs time, money, and strong leadership, all things Rome was slowly losing. The army still existed, still marched, still fought, but it no longer felt like one single force, more like many smaller forces wearing the same uniform. The soul was fading. Now imagine a Roman general walking along a line of troops before a battle. In earlier centuries, he would feel proud, confident, energized. But now, he sees tired eyes, mismatched armor, soldiers wondering if Rome even remembers they're here. He gives a speech, but but the men don't cheer the way they used to, not because they are cowards, they are not, but because the spark that once lit the Roman military is dimming. Rome still has an army, but the heart of the army, the thing that made it so powerful, is slipping away. Another problem rises: commanders. In Rome's early days, generals earned their positions through skill, honor, and years of service, but later, politics took over. Some commanders got their jobs because they had the right friends, or because they promised loyalty to the emperor, or because they looked good in armor. This led to mistakes, bad strategies, conflicts between generals, rivalries that sometimes ended with swords drawn not against the enemy, but against each other. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the frustration of the old Roman generals whispering through time. What are you doing? This is not how you run an army. But their voices were drowned out by politics and chaos. And then, the final twist: the army began depending on tribes outside the empire for help, not just hiring them individually, but inviting whole groups to settle inside Rome's borders, in exchange for military service. It worked at first. These groups were strong fighters, but when they weren't treated fairly, or when Rome failed to provide land or pay, things went downhill fast. Some rebelled, some switched loyalty, some fought Rome from the inside. The once legendary army was now a patchwork quilt of different people, different goals, and different loyalties stitched together with fraying thread. By the time the moon rises in this chapter's quiet night scene, the truth becomes clear. Rome's army didn't fall apart in one big moment. It lost itself slowly, one late payment at a time, one desperate hiring decision at a time, one fading piece of loyalty at a time. What was once the sharp sword of the empire had become dull, not useless, but no longer unbreakable. And when the winds of future dangers began to blow, Rome's army found itself standing with old sandals, thin armor, and a soul that felt a little too tired. The giants who once marched with fearless pride were now walking in twilight, and the chapters ahead will show just how deeply that twilight spreads. Now, let's leave the big marble cities behind for a moment. Let's travel far, really far, to the edge of the empire. No fancy statues here, no grand temples, just quiet hills, cold rivers, and small towns that sometimes wondered if Rome even remembered they existed. The provinces were the outer limbs of the empire, and just like limbs, they needed care, warmth, and a little attention every now and then. But Rome was too busy arguing, partying, and managing its disasters of the week. So these far-off regions started to drift, slowly, quietly, not because they hated Rome, but because Rome simply stopped writing back. A bit like someone ghosting you, but on an imperial level. Picture a small frontier village, a wooden watchtower leaning to one side, farmers working fields that once fed whole legions, a tired governor sitting at a desk stacked with requests he no longer sends to Rome because, well, Rome doesn't reply anyway. Over time, corruption began to grow here. Not loud, dramatic corruption, but the small kind, the just a little tax on top kind, the maybe I'll keep these supplies for myself kind. And the people, they noticed. They always notice. Imagine being a family living out there. You pay taxes, you send grain, you send soldiers, but the roads crumble. Bandits roam, and Rome's help arrives later, and then not at all. It's like being part of a group project where you do all the work and your teammates don't even know your name. Soon, loyalty begins to fade, not with anger, but with a tired sigh. People start relying on local leaders instead of distant emperors. They follow whoever keeps them fed and safe. If that's Rome, great. If it's someone else, well, everyone likes options. Meanwhile, Rome assumes everything is fine, because Rome always assumes everything is fine. They were too far away to see that in these outer lands, new worlds were forming. Different cultures mixing with Roman customs, different rules, different priorities. In some places, the locals welcomed migrating tribes and newcomers. They traded with them, made agreements, sometimes even lived together. It wasn't chaos, it was just life adapting. But Rome, stuck in old ways, didn't see it as adaptation. They saw it as disobedience. Even though they had left these provinces on silent mode for years, these forgotten regions slowly lost the feeling of being Roman, not on purpose. It just happened. When a place stops hearing Rome's voice, Rome stops being real. Troops stationed there were often unpaid, supplies grew thin, and troops with empty pockets tend to get creative. Some settled down with locals. Some traded weapons for food. Some said, you know what? I'm not marching all the way back to Rome. I live here now. Imagine the empire as a giant blanket, warm, comforting, protective. But over time, the edges start to fray. A thread pulls loose here, another there. Tiny rips forming where no one is looking. That was the western provinces. No battles, no dramatic speeches. Just slow, gentle separation, like drifting countenance. In Spain, in Britain, in parts of Gaul, Rome's influence faded like an old painting losing color. Local rulers stepped up, communities organized themselves, and Rome was no longer the hero of their story. It was just a faraway idea. The saddest part, most of these places didn't want to break away. They had been Roman for centuries. They built Roman towns, Roman baths, Roman roads. Okay, the roads lasted longer than the empire, but that's another story. But when the heart of the empire forgets its hands and feet, those hands and feet start to move on their own. By the time Rome finally noticed, it was like trying to reconnect with a friend you ignored for 5 years. You can send a letter, maybe even a soldier or two, but the bond just isn't the same anymore. This slow drifting apart weakened the empire without any noise or drama. It was one of the quietest causes of Rome's fall, and one of the most human. People simply took care of the places that took care of them, and Rome wasn't one of those places anymore. Let's breathe for a moment. The empire is still standing, but now, its edges are fading like fog at sunrise, and in that spreading fog, new powers are waiting. In the next chapter, we'll meet them. Now, let's shift our attention from Rome's quiet troubles to the neighbors who were slowly moving closer. For a long time, Roman writers loved calling them barbarians, but honestly, most of these groups were not wild warriors screaming in the mountains. They were families, farmers, travelers, just people looking for a safer place to live, a bit of land, and maybe a warm meal. Picture long lines of wagons, children riding on top, old men walking with wooden staffs, mothers carrying baskets, a whole community on the move, not because they wanted to fight Rome, but because they were running from something even bigger. That something was the Huns. The Huns were like a huge storm approaching from the east. Fast riders, powerful warriors, the kind of people you definitely wouldn't want chasing you across a field. And behind them, many tribes, Goths, Vandals, Alans, Franks were pushed westward like waves driven by a strong wind. And guess who was standing right where those waves were heading? Rome. Now, imagine Rome, tired and stressed, looking up and seeing thousands of newcomers standing at the river border. Not an enemy army, but huge groups of families asking to come in. Not to destroy Rome, not to burn cities, just to live. At first, Rome actually said yes. The empire had always welcomed migrants. They needed new workers, new soldiers, new communities. It was a win-win, in theory, but this time, things didn't go as planned. Rome's officials, surprised, got greedy. They saw these desperate newcomers and said, you can enter, but only if you pay, and not normal payment. We're talking about shameful levels of bribery, everything from gold to livestock too. In many sad cases, people being taken and sold. Imagine crossing the border hoping for safety, and instead finding corruption waiting with open hands. It didn't take long before anger began to grow. But even then, most of these tribes didn't want war, they wanted cooperation. Many tried to settle peacefully, farm Roman land, serve in the Roman army. Some even admired Rome. They wore Roman clothes, learned Latin, and copied Roman architecture. But Rome never fully trusted them. To the empire, these newcomers were useful, but always outsiders. Rome liked to use them, but not include them. And that tension soft at first became one of the biggest stories of the empire's final days. Meanwhile, these tribes were changing over time. They developed stronger leaders, warriors who had grown up fighting for survival, smart chiefs who negotiated with Rome like seasoned diplomats. Whole nations formed from groups that had once been scattered. They became new powers not because they wanted to destroy Rome, but because Rome left space for their rise. Think of it like a table where one person keeps falling asleep. Eventually, someone else will sit at the head. In the Germanic forests, kings began forming. In the Danube regions, alliances grew. Across the Rhine, new villages expanded into strong, organized communities. These groups didn't plan to replace Rome, but Rome was slowly stepping aside without even noticing. And remember those forgotten frontier provinces from the last chapter? Those places started connecting more with these new neighbors than with Rome itself. Trade increased, alliances formed, cultures mixed. It wasn't a sudden enemy invasion. It was a slow changing of the guard. Rome was still the giant of Europe, but the ground beneath its feet was shifting. These tribes were patient. They watched. They learned Roman tactics, studied Roman politics, even served in Roman legions. Some commanders in the Roman army were actually from these very tribes. But you can probably guess what happens when your strongest soldiers don't feel loyal to you anymore. As Rome weakened from the inside, these rising powers filled the gaps, managing lands, defending borders, even negotiating with Roman officials like equal states. By the time Rome looked around, it wasn't surrounded by barbarians. It was surrounded by nations, organized, ambitious, and very aware of Rome's growing tiredness. So here we are. On one side, an empire slowly losing its energy. On the other, new peoples rising with fresh purpose. It wasn't an explosion. It was a gentle but unstoppable shift. A change of balance. A new chapter for the world. And right in the middle, a spiritual transformation was brewing, one that would reshape the empire from the inside out. Let's take a deep breath and step into one of the quietest, most powerful transformations in Rome's long story. A shift not caused by swords or armies, but by ideas, hopes, fears, and faith. Long before Rome fell, its spiritual world was already changing. You can imagine the old Roman gods sitting on a cloud somewhere, looking confused as fewer and fewer people showed up at their temples. Jupiter checking his calendar like, strange. No sacrifices scheduled for the third week in a row. Meanwhile, someone's grandma down the street is whispering a Christian prayer over her dinner. That's how the transition began, soft, slow, personal. For centuries, Rome's religion had been a colorful parade of gods, festivals, elaborate rituals, and honestly, a pretty dramatic mythological cast. Lightning throwers, sea kings, goddesses of grain, love, and hearth fires. You name it, Rome had it. Religion was everywhere, in politics, in farming, in the army, in family life. Every action had a proper ceremony, every ceremony had a rule, and every rule had a priest who knew exactly what expensive thing you needed to offer. But by the 3rd and 4th centuries, something was changing. The old rituals felt heavy, the temples felt distant, the gods felt, well, a little too busy or too quiet during hard times. People were searching for something that felt closer, kinder, more hopeful, especially in an empire dealing with war, disease, and uncertainty. And into that search stepped Christianity. Now, Christianity didn't just appear inside Rome like a magic trick. It grew slowly, spread carefully, whispered from one home to another. It started among the poor, the enslaved, the forgotten people who needed a message of comfort more than anyone. It taught that every person mattered, that the mighty and the weak stood equal before God, that kindness was strength, and that suffering had meaning. These ideas struck deep. They weren't about ceremonies or sacrifices. They were about connection, love, forgiveness, and a sense that someone, somewhere, was listening. At first, Rome didn't like this. The empire saw Christianity as suspicious, too different, too stubborn, too unwilling to take part in the usual Roman traditions. Romans loved order, and Christians refused to bow to the old gods or swear by them. This made the authorities nervous. So Christians faced persecution, sometimes terrible persecution. But here is the twist. Persecution didn't weaken Christianity. It strengthened it. Communities grew closer. Faith became deeper. And people watching from the outside saw a religion built not on power, but on loyalty, hope, and courage. By the time Emperor Constantine appeared on the stage, Christianity wasn't a tiny movement anymore. It had grown roots all across the empire. In cities, in towns, in the hearts of soldiers, merchants, and families, Constantine changed everything. After claiming to see a vision that promised victory, he embraced the Christian symbol and won an important battle. And Rome, a place that once demanded sacrifices to Jupiter before war, suddenly saw its leader praying to a different god. Constantine legalized Christianity. Soon after, Christian bishops became trusted advisors. Churches were built. The empire slowly shifted from many gods to one. But here's the part many people misunderstand. Christianity didn't cause Rome to fall. That's too simple. Way too simple. The empire was already struggling politically, economically, militarily. If Rome were a giant ship, it already had several leaks before Christianity even became mainstream. What Christianity did was change the culture, the mood, the way people thought about power, duty, and life. Imagine a city used to grand festivals, wild parades for Bacchus, dramatic rituals for Mars, temple celebrations that lasted all night. Suddenly, those festivals slowed down. Some stopped altogether. The new faith focused less on public spectacle and more on inner devotion. It was a calmer world, but also a different one. Old temples lost funding. Priests of the old gods found their roles fading. Artists who once carved Jupiter started carving crosses. Mysteries that were once sung to Apollo now belonged to a very different kind of worship. This wasn't destruction, it was transformation. But every transformation creates friction. The army, for example, had long tied its identity to the old gods. Mars was literally the god of war. Victory was believed to come from ritual and divine favor. Christianity changed those traditions. Some soldiers welcomed the new faith, others felt disconnected from their military heritage. In politics, Christian officials pushed for mercy, charity, and moral reform. Good ideas, yes, but sometimes difficult in a world built on strict discipline and harsh decisions. In daily life, Christian teachings encouraged humility and peace, beautiful values. But in a rough world, not everyone agreed on how practical they were. So the spiritual shift didn't break Rome, it simply reshaped it during a time when Rome was already fragile. Think of it like a tired tree in late autumn. The leaves fall not because they killed the tree, but because the tree was already preparing for a change. By the late Empire, Christianity had become the dominant faith. Church leaders often held more influence than local governors. Bishops spoke with authority that even generals listened to. And ordinary people found comfort not in old sacrifices, but in quiet prayer. What's most beautiful is how gentle the change really was. There weren't massive temple-smashing riots. No sudden bans, no huge explosions of cultural chaos. Instead, it was a soft, steady shift, one candle lighting another. The old religion didn't vanish overnight. It faded, like a song slowly growing quieter, and the new faith rose like dawn, slowly pushing away the dark. Rome's identity changed, its art changed, its values changed, its dreams changed. But Rome itself, it didn't disappear. It simply grew a new soul. By the time the empire's final century began, Christianity was deeply woven into everything: law, culture, leadership, everyday life. People prayed before meals, church bells echoed in the morning. Children grew up hearing stories, not of Hercules, but of saints. Rome was still Rome, but also not Rome anymore. And while this spiritual shift didn't weaken the empire in the way some old historians claimed, it did something else. It made the fall of the empire feel less like an ending, and more like a passage into a new world. A world where the old gods gently stepped back, and a new faith stepped forward to guide the centuries ahead. While people debated gods, emperors, and taxes, the earth quietly did its own thing. No speeches, no parades, no Roman Senate meetings, just wind, sun, rain, and occasional bad luck. And, as it turns out, sometimes the earth can be a more powerful force than an army, a law, or even a clever emperor. Imagine a Roman farmer in Gaul or Italy. He wakes early, just like always, to tend his wheat fields. He checks the soil, the sun rises, the birds chirp, and nothing seems out of place, at least, not yet. But over the years, weather patterns began to shift. Rain became less predictable. Some years brought droughts, others too much rain. Crops failed in ways that were subtle at first. Maybe a bad harvest here, a thin yield there. Farmers shrugged, blaming gods, chance, or bad luck. But then the small failures added up. Grain stores that once filled entire cities grew dangerously low. Markets began to empty. Bread, the staple of life, became more expensive. And for people who lived day to day, that mattered more than political intrigue or philosophical debates. Now, picture the city of Rome, buzzing with life in the early morning. Bakers rolled dough, merchants shout over fruit stalls, and citizens strolled down the streets in their tunics. Everything seems normal, but the supply ships carrying grain from distant provinces arrive late. Sometimes they carry less than usual. Sometimes storms block the route entirely. People line up outside bakeries. Conversations are quiet. No one wants to say the words out loud. There isn't enough. The empire could always send soldiers to enforce order, bribe governors, or import grain from other lands. But when multiple provinces face poor harvests at once, the empire struggles to respond. Rome had the resources but stretched across thousands of miles. It couldn't react fast enough. Imagine trying to feed a hungry city from 500 miles away. Even with the best planning, some bread is going to fall between the cracks. And as the climate shifted, nature didn't just make farmers sweat, shook the economy, weakened the army, and left cities vulnerable. Take the north, for instance. Cooler temperatures meant shorter growing seasons. Fields that once produced plenty now struggled to ripen in time. Soldiers stationed on cold frontiers grew thin and tired because local farms could no longer sustain them. And when soldiers were hungry, their loyalty became negotiable. Meanwhile, in the south, excessive heat sometimes killed olive trees and vineyards. Wine and oil, staples of Roman life, became scarcer and more expensive. Everyone felt rich and poor alike because even the emperor enjoyed a good cup of wine. Famine wasn't dramatic like a storm that knocks down buildings. It crept, it whispered, it lingered, and it caused subtle ripple effects. Farmers left their lands in search of survival. Trade slowed. Cities were left quieter. Villages on the frontiers felt abandoned. And the farther you got from Rome, the less help arrived. Think of it this way. If the empire were a human body, famine and climate shifts were like a slow fever. It didn't immediately kill the patient, but it sapped strength, made the system sluggish, and left wounds open for infection or, in Rome's case, for political instability, invading armies, and plagues. And, of course, the empire's response was not perfect. Roman officials tried measures like price controls, forced grain shipments, and stockpiling reserves. They even tried creating special farming incentives. But all of these solutions had limits. 1,000 years of bureaucracy couldn't beat a sudden cold snap or a drought that stretched for years. Imagine filling a bucket with water, only to realize the bucket has a tiny leak. You patch one spot, the leak shifts, another appears. Eventually, no amount of patching can keep the bucket dry forever. Rome's vast network of provinces, armies, and cities acted like that bucket, and climate change was slowly, quietly, opening cracks all over. Famine also affected migration. People abandoned farms and small towns in search of food. Families traveled toward cities, toward rivers, toward borders. And when they arrived, cities were already crowded. Resources stretched thin. Tensions grew not just between locals and migrants, but between citizens and the empire itself. The empire tried to regulate food distribution. Sometimes it succeeded, sometimes it failed, and when it failed, the people noticed. The silent trust Rome had built over centuries began to fray, much like the outer provinces we explored earlier. Even the army felt these changes. Soldiers stationed far from home were less well-fed than usual. Morale dropped. Some units mutinied or deserted. Others became more susceptible to bribery or switching loyalty. A hungry soldier is rarely a happy soldier. Then came the smaller, less obvious disasters: floods, unpredictable winters, hailstorms, even volcanic eruptions in distant regions. While these events may seem minor or localized, their cumulative effect on the empire was massive. Food became scarce, trade slowed, taxes couldn't be collected as reliably, and small crises in one province often became major problems in another. Nature, in other words, wasn't just a backdrop, it was a silent player, quietly shaping the empire's destiny. And Rome, magnificent and proud, could not control it. Let's pause and imagine the scene. A quiet farm on the edge of Gaul. The sun sets over fields that didn't yield enough grain this year. A mother wipes sweat from her forehead. A father walks to check a small river that has dried up earlier than usual. Children play with sticks in empty dirt paths. Everything feels calm, almost peaceful. But the signs are there. Nature is rearranging the deck. And the empire, with all its laws, armies, and traditions, is just a single player in a much larger game. By the time we look back over the empire from above, the picture becomes clear. Rome faced armies, politics, and internal decay. Yes, but it also faced the earth itself. Changing weather, famine, and environmental shifts did not strike like lightning. They crept like fog. They whispered like wind through wheat fields. They moved slowly, yet relentlessly. And because these changes were quiet, many Romans underestimated them. Few realized that a poor harvest in Gaul could ripple all the way to Rome. Few understood that rivers flooding in one province could starve soldiers thousands of miles away. Rome's enemies may have been loud, but the earth itself was even louder if you listened closely. And this is the lesson. Sometimes the most powerful forces are the quietest, the invisible ones. The ones that don't make headlines, but still shape history. In the next chapter, we will meet one of these invisible forces, plagues that swept through the empire, diseases that no sword could fight, silent storms even more deadly than famine. The world outside Rome was changing, and Rome, tired, stretched and hungry, was beginning to feel the pressure from all sides. While Rome was juggling its overextended borders, shrinking farms, and the slow creep of climate disasters, another threat crept quietly through the empire. It had no army, no banners, no chariots, yet it could weaken Rome faster than any invader or politician ever could. It was disease. Plagues were nothing new to the Romans. They had lived with fever, dysentery, and strange illnesses for centuries. But in the empire's last centuries, plagues became more frequent, more deadly, and far harder to control. Sometimes they arrived silently on a merchant's ship. Sometimes they traveled along roads lined with soldiers, farmers, and travelers. And by the time anyone noticed, the damage was done. Imagine walking through a bustling Roman street. The sun rises over the forum. Merchants set out baskets of olives and bread. Children run between columns. A dog barks. It looks normal, perfectly ordinary, but one corner of the city is already emptying. People are sick. Families are mourning. Markets are quieter than they should be. The streets smell different, not of food, but of sickness. No one knows who will fall ill next. No one knows how many will survive. And the invisible enemy moves faster than rumors, faster than news, faster than anyone can react. Some historians call this the plague of Cyprian, a mysterious illness in the 3rd century. Later came the plague of Justinian, which would devastate parts of the Eastern Empire. Symptoms were terrifying: fever, vomiting, rashes, exhaustion, sudden death, and the dead, sometimes so many that burial rituals could barely keep up. Imagine a Roman family trying to carry on normal life. A mother tends the children, a father works the fields, and suddenly a neighbor is gone, then another, then someone in the family falls sick. It was invisible, unpredictable, terrifying. Plagues didn't just kill people, they weakened society. Slowly, almost silently, they frayed the threads holding the empire together. Farms suffered first. If farmers were sick or dead, fields went and tilled. Food grew scarce. Grain shipments to cities were delayed or diminished. Cities that once felt lively now faced hunger alongside disease. Next, the army suffered. Roman soldiers were only as strong as the men who stood behind them. A plague that swept through a garrison left units under strength, tired, and less loyal. A soldier worried about survival is not the same as a soldier thinking about honor or glory. You can't pay a fever with gold. You can't inspire courage in someone who feels their body might betray them at any moment. And the empire's economy, plague was disastrous. Trade slowed as travelers avoided infected cities. Taxes dropped as farmers died or abandoned their lands. Merchants hesitated to ship goods. Rome's money, already weakened by inflation and heavy taxation, took another hit. The invisible enemy didn't care about borders, forts, or walls. It spread quietly along roads, rivers, and sea routes. And with every silent traveler it carried, it left the empire a little weaker, a little slower, a little more vulnerable. Social life changed too. People stayed home. Markets emptied. Temples, which had always been places for gathering and hope, became quiet. Families whispered prayers, sometimes to old gods, sometimes to new. Hospitals or their ancient equivalents, doctors struggled, remedies often failed, and fear spread faster than the disease itself. Neighbors avoided neighbors. Strangers became enemies, not because they were violent, but because they carried an invisible threat. Imagine walking through a forum once filled with laughter, only to find it quiet, empty, tense. The air is heavy. People glance nervously. The plague has touched everything: life, work, faith, and hope. Even emperors could not control it. A ruler might send doctors, decree quarantines, or order grain shipments, but these measures often arrived too late. Plague was democratic in the cruelest way possible. Rich or poor, governor or farmer, soldier or senator, it could touch anyone, and the psychological toll was enormous. Fear breeds panic. Panic breeds mistakes. Mistakes weaken armies, confuse officials, and leave cities vulnerable. Rome, already stretched thin by borders, politics and climate, now faced another layer of fragility. Plague also contributed to population decline, a subtle but powerful factor in the empire's weakening. Fewer people meant fewer soldiers, fewer farmers, fewer taxpayers, and with fewer people, the empire's ability to defend itself, feed itself, and govern itself decreased. It was not a dramatic sword slicing through Rome. It was more like a soft, persistent wind eroding a cliff. You don't notice the change until part of the cliff falls. By then, the damage is real. And yet, Romans kept living. They adapted. They prayed. They buried their dead. They rebuilt farms. They tried to carry on, day by day, even as death moved quietly through streets and fields. There is a strange calm in imagining this. A city still functioning, still alive, even as it faces invisible danger. Markets still open. Bakers still baking. Teachers still teaching. Soldiers still marching. Life, stubborn as ever, continues in the shadow of the unseen storm. By the end of this quiet chapter, we see that Rome's collapse wasn't caused by one single enemy, one sudden disaster, or one dramatic moment. It was cumulative, slow, silent. Climate, famine, economic strain, and armies already stretched too thin created the perfect conditions, and plagues. Plagues quietly delivered the final blows in ways that swords could not. Rome was still Rome, still standing, still majestic, but every silent plague, every sickened farmer, every weakened soldier added to the cracks forming in its mighty walls. And soon, those cracks would become impossible to ignore. In the next chapter, we will explore the political division that Trident failed to hold the empire together, the East, the West, and the slowly widening gap between them, a split that would shape the centuries to come. As Rome's troubles quietly piled up overstretched borders, restless armies, invisible plagues, and shifting climates, and other change was taking place that few in the West fully noticed. The empire was splitting, not with shouts or swords at first, but almost like a slow sigh. The West on one side, the East on the other. Imagine a giant tree with two main branches. One branch grows toward the setting sun, the other toward the rising sun. Both branches are part of the same tree, but the leaves, fruits, and birds on each branch begin to live in slightly different worlds. Rome, in its old sense, was that tree. The West struggled. The East thrived. The Eastern Empire, later called Byzantium, grew stronger, richer, and more organized as the Western Empire stumbled. Its cities were full of trade, its roads well maintained, its armies disciplined, its borders watched carefully. Meanwhile, the West was busy patching holes in old walls, feeding hungry cities, and trying to pay soldiers who might or might not fight for Rome. Picture two governors, one in Constantinople, one in Ravenna. The one in the east wakes each day and finds the treasury full, the roads quiet, and the markets vibrant. He can focus on long-term plans. He can build monuments, improve ports, and invest in education and diplomacy. The governor in the west wakes two letters about unpaid soldiers, empty granaries, and reports of bandits raiding frontier villages. He spends more time calming panic than planning futures. By the time he reads a message from the emperor, the situation has already shifted. It's not that the East is cruel or selfish. It's just that geography, climate, and history have combined to make one side of the empire stronger than the other. The division between East and West had started long before the empire fell. Emperors like Diocletian and Constantine realized the empire was simply too vast to govern from one city. So they split administration. Two capitals, two courts, two sets of officials. It made sense. It was practical. It worked. For a while. But the human mind is tricky. When one side thrives while the other struggles, resentment grows. Trust begins to fade. And when trust fades, loyalty becomes complicated. The West, already exhausted, watched as the East grew stronger, almost like a younger sibling excelling while the elder struggles. Sometimes, the West asked for help. Occasionally, the East provided it. But often, the East had its own problems, or thought the West should solve its own troubles, and so the gap widened. The split also affected the military. The West's armies were stretched thin, tired, and often relying on mercenaries. The East could maintain disciplined troops and a better supply chain. When the Visigoths or Vandals moved westward, the East could watch and calculate, but couldn't or wouldn't always intervene. The West had to face challenges largely on its own. Imagine standing on a bridge while the water rises below. Your neighbor on the next bridge is safe, dry and well-fed. You shout across for help. They nod politely. You hope. But the current grows stronger anyway. The Western Empire faced its floods and storms alone. Economically, the East became a hub of wealth, trade, and culture. Constantinople's harbors overflowed with goods from Africa, Asia, and the Mediterranean. Coins clinked, markets buzzed, knowledge thrived. Meanwhile, Western cities struggled to maintain the roads, ports, and granaries that had once made Rome the heartbeat of Europe. Culturally, the East embraced refinement and bureaucracy. Officials were educated, trained, and professional. Art and architecture flourished. Meanwhile, the West's cities decayed. Monuments crumbled. Once grand forums became quiet squares, and the grandeur that had inspired awe in visitors slowly faded. Even the Roman Senate, which had survived centuries, lost influence in the West. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, the emperor's court worked with efficiency, law, and rituals that projected power and stability. It's almost as if the West was a tired old ship at sea, taking on water, and the East was a gleaming new vessel, sailing with purpose. The religious divide also followed these lines. Christianity, now the dominant faith, had different flavors in East and West. The East leaned toward theological debates, councils, and structured rituals. The West struggled to maintain bishops, clergy, and proper doctrine amid chaos and famine. Faith was one thing, but organization another, and the West often felt overshadowed by the East's disciplined structure. Politically, the split meant two emperors, two courts, two sets of policies. Sometimes they cooperated, sometimes they argued, sometimes the West asked for money, troops, or guidance. Sometimes the East was generous, other times not so much. The West had to solve its own problems, and it had many. The Eastern escape also changed how Rome thought about its borders. For centuries, the empire had prided itself on stretching from Britain to North Africa, from Spain to Mesopotamia. It was a single, indivisible force. But now, the West could no longer rely on reinforcements from the East. If enemies appeared, it was on its own. If crops failed or plagues struck, it was on its own. If mercenaries deserted, it was on its own. The Eastern Empire was no longer an automatic safety net. It had escaped into a world of its own. And the West began to feel smaller, weaker, and alone. Yet, this separation didn't feel dramatic at first. It wasn't like the West suddenly woke up one morning and said, "Oh no, we're all alone." It was subtle, a quiet realization, a few missed reinforcements here, a delayed shipment there, a policy ignored, and the gaps widened slowly. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the West was struggling under its own weight. The army, already stretched thin, was now even more vulnerable. The provinces, neglected and drifting, were harder to defend. The economy, still reeling from famine, climate change, and plagues, could not support a full-scale defense. Meanwhile, the East sailed on. Constantinople stood as a shining city, confident, wealthy, and prepared. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The empire that had once been a single, seemingly invincible force was now two separate worlds. The Western Empire would now have to face its final trials largely on its own. Its enemies were not as polite as the Eastern Empire either. Goths, Vandals, Huns, and other migrating peoples would test its strength. The cracks that had been quietly forming for centuries, climate, economy, armies, religion, were now dangerously exposed. And all of this set the stage for a dramatic moment in history. The West's slow, inevitable weakening would soon meet the pressure of external forces, and Rome, the eternal city, would have to confront the reality that even empires cannot escape time, change, and the shifting currents of history. By now, the Western Roman Empire was stretched thin, tired, and quietly leaking strength from every corner. But even in these difficult times, Rome tried. Oh, how Rome tried. Emperors like Diocletian and Constantine were aware of the cracks, the leaks, the faltering heartbeat of the empire. They didn't just sit in marble palaces, sipping wine and watching sunsets. They rolled up their togas, picked up their administrative tools, and tried to patch the empire together. Sometimes you have to admire their ambition. Diocletian, for instance, faced an empire that seemed like a giant ship, slowly taking on water. His solution: build more lifeboats. divide responsibilities, share power. He introduced the tetrarchia system of 4 rulers, each managing different corners of the empire. It sounds clever, and, on paper, it was each ruler could focus on their region, respond to local threats, and keep the machine moving. But in practice, human nature is messy. For emperors sometimes meant for sets of ambitions, for armies, for treasuries, and for very different ideas of what Rome should be. It's a bit like trying to fix a leaky roof with 4 people, each thinking they know best, but none agreeing on where to start. One patches the tiles, another reinforces the beams, a third starts building a new chimney, and the fourth just takes a nap. The empire stayed afloat for a while, but cracks widened anyway. Then came Constantine. He moved the capital to the east, what would become Constantinople, solidified Christianity as a state religion. A bold move, yes. It stabilized parts of the empire, strengthened the eastern provinces, and gave people a unifying identity. Yet, in the west, problems persisted. Constantine's reforms didn't magically refill granaries. They didn't suddenly make soldiers loyal. They didn't solve the stubborn issues of taxation, corruption, and overextension. Rome tried new administrative divisions, reorganized the army, and even implemented wage reforms and price controls. Some of these measures worked temporarily. Soldiers were fed, roads repaired, grain delivered. But the moment the pressure returned, be it plague, famine, or invasion, these solutions crumbled like old mortar. The army, especially, revealed the limits of reform. Once the backbone of the empire, it had already changed. Citizen soldiers were rare. Mercenaries now filled the ranks. Some were loyal only to paychecks. And when the empire could not pay, desertion, rebellion, or negotiation became more common. Emperors attempted recruitment drives, raised new taxes, and reorganized legions. But the problem was not just numbers. It was morale, loyalty, and the slow erosion of civic pride. Even the cleverest reforms could not restore a sense of shared purpose that had faded over centuries. Economically, reforms had similar limits. Rome tried to stabilize currency, control prices, and enforce tax collection. But too much debt, corruption, and shrinking populations made these efforts feel like holding back a river with a sieve. Farmers were still struggling with climate changes, poor harvests, and occasional raids. Merchants faced plagues and slow-moving trade routes. And as the economy faltered, the empire's ability to fund its own defenses and infrastructure weakened. Even the bureaucratic genius of Diocletian and Constantine could not overcome the sheer weight of accumulated problems. Every clever decree could only go so far. There was also the problem of timing. Reforms were often reactive rather than proactive. Leaders patched crises as they arose, rather than addressing the deeper, structural causes. Imagine patching a roof during a thunderstorm. You can stop the leaks in one corner, but another tile falls off somewhere else. Another leak opens, unseen. By the end of the day, the house is still wet inside, no matter how hard you tried. This is what happened in the Western Empire. Diocletian and Constantine were the best patches Rome had seen in centuries, but the storms, economic, environmental, military, were relentless, and reforms often had unintended consequences. Tax collection, for example, became stricter. Good in theory, necessary even, but it placed enormous pressure on farmers already struggling with poor harvests. Some abandoned their lands, some hid their income, others simply grumbled and obeyed only enough to avoid punishment. Attempted price controls angered merchants. Soldiers sometimes went unpaid when officials mismanaged funds, and local governors, left to enforce policies they neither created nor fully understood, often became corrupt or ineffective. It was a system that looked organized on paper, but felt fragile on the ground. The empire also faced cultural and psychological limits. Centuries of stability had built habits, expectations, and traditions that could not be changed overnight. Trying to impose reform on millions of people across thousands of miles was like trying to teach an old dog to knit. You can try, you can even succeed in small parts, but the bigger picture often resists. Even Constantine's religious reforms, though deeply transformative, could not instantly unify people. The West remained chaotic, underpopulated, and divided. The East, more disciplined and wealthy, thrived. And the West began to feel the full weight of isolation and vulnerability. By the late 4th century, the empire had learned a crucial lesson. even the most brilliant reformer cannot control everything. Money, soldiers, laws, and taxes matter, but they cannot entirely fix structural decay, natural disasters, or centuries of human habits. The Western Empire was, in essence, a giant ship with a clever crew trying desperately to plug holes with whatever they had on hand. Temporary fixes worked for a time, but the leaks kept appearing, the water kept rising, and in history, a ship can stay afloat for decades with skillful patching, but eventually, even the best crew reaches the limit of human effort. It is tempting to blame failure entirely on the emperors themselves, but history is rarely that simple. Diocletian and Constantine were not lazy. They were visionary, competent, and tireless. The failures were not personal, they were systemic. The empire itself had grown too vast, too stretched, too fragile. No reform could instantly restore loyalty, feed millions, or calm a restless population spread across continents. No reform could stop plagues, droughts, famines, and invading tribes. What reforms did, however, was slow the decline. They bought time. They allowed some provinces to survive a little longer. They preserved structures that would influence future civilizations. But in the end, Rome's reforms could not stop the inevitable. The cracks in the Western Empire, long forming, continued to widen, and soon those cracks would become impossible to ignore. The next chapter will bring us to a dramatic moment in Rome's story, the sack of the city itself by the Visigoths, a moment both terrifying and symbolic, showing that even the mightiest empire can face the consequences of slow decay. By the early 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was tired, stretched thin, and quietly unraveling. Borders were weak, armies were thin, economy, morale, and even faith were tested to their limits. And yet, Rome, the eternal city, still stood, proud and magnificent. But one evening, in 410 CE, the unimaginable quietly happened. The gates of Rome opened. Now, let's be clear, this wasn't a dramatic, apocalyptic invasion in the movies. No dragons, no catapults blasting the walls, no heroic last stand of legions. Instead, it was a slow, tragic, almost human story. The Visigoths, led by Alaric, approached Rome, not as ruthless monsters hell-bent on destruction, but as people pushed by circumstance, families searching for safety, hungry warriors hoping to be fed, a group that had been promised land, respect, and opportunity, and had been denied. Picture the scene, a line of wagons, children on horseback, elders leaning on canes, all under the shadow of the city walls. They had fought, negotiated, begged, and waited, but Rome, exhausted and distracted, failed to respond adequately. And finally, the gates were opened. The sack itself was more about survival than wanton destruction. The Visigoths were angry, yes, but they were also pragmatic. Rome had promised things and failed. Rome had asked for loyalty and respect, but offered little in return. And so, when Alaric's forces entered the city, it became a lesson in human patience and, unfortunately, human frustration. Streets that had once echoed with merchants' cries were now eerily quiet. People huddled in their homes, uncertain of what to expect. Some Roman nobles tried to negotiate, others fled. Temples were looted, but not systematically destroyed. It was not annihilation. It was a statement. Rome is no longer untouchable. Think of it this way. Imagine a grand mansion, centuries old, filled with priceless treasures. It has withstood storms, fires, and thieves for hundreds of years. But now, the caretakers are tired. The doors are unlocked. The people inside are distracted. And those who had been asking for help, for shelter, for recognition, finally step in. It is not chaos, it is consequence. The Visigoths were not outsiders to be blamed entirely. Rome itself had created the conditions for this night: neglect, exhaustion, and broken promises. And yet, the symbolism was enormous. For the first time in 800 years, Rome had been breached by a foreign force. Even if the city would recover, even if life continued afterward, the world saw something new. The eternal city could fall, the untouchable could be touched, and the myths of invincibility began to crumble. Imagine the citizens' emotions: fear, of course, shock, grief, but also a strange calm. Many Romans had been living in quiet anxiety for decades. The political chaos, the economic strain, the plagues all had already prepared them for disappointment. When the gates opened, it was dramatic, yes, but not entirely unexpected. Alaric and his Visigoths did not burn Rome entirely. They took what they needed: They negotiated, they survived, they remembered their humanity, and in doing so, they left a lesson for history. Empires are only as strong as the trust, loyalty, and attention of the people they govern. Rome, despite its size and grandeur, had been neglectful. It had failed to maintain the bonds that had once united soldiers, citizens, and neighboring tribes. The result, a city that could no longer claim absolute invincibility. The psychological impact extended far beyond the city walls. News traveled slowly, but it traveled to the far provinces, the northern frontiers, and the distant towns. If Rome, the great capital, could be breached, what hope remained for anyone else relying on the empire's protection? Merchants reconsidered their routes. Farmers hesitated to send grain to Rome. Soldiers questioned their pay, loyalty, and future. And across Europe, the idea of Roman immortality began to fade. And yet, in the midst of tragedy, life continued. Bakers still baked. Children still played. Temples, though looted, were repaired. Officials returned to their offices. Rome, though shaken, endured. This is an important point. The sack of Rome in 410 CE was dramatic, yes, but it was not the death of the empire. It was a vivid reminder that empires, like humans, are mortal. Even giants eventually grow tired. Even the eternal city could bend under pressure. And what about Alaric and his Visigoths? They did not linger indefinitely. They moved on, seeking lands, resources, and agreements elsewhere. Rome remained standing, but the aura of invincibility, the quiet confidence that the city would always be safe, was gone forever. Imagine the citizens walking the streets afterward. The shadows seemed longer, the city quieter, the monuments still proud, yes, but no longer untouchable. And slowly, a new understanding settled in. Rome was resilient, yes, but it was also human. The night the gates opened was both an ending and a beginning. An ending of the idea that Rome was impervious, a beginning of the realization that survival required adaptation, patience, and humility. It was also a deeply human moment, a lesson in negotiation, in consequences, and in the delicate balance of trust between rulers and ruled, host and guest, soldier and citizen. Rome's story would continue. Of course, the empire did not vanish overnight. The Western Empire would struggle on for decades, still magnificent in parts, still monumental, still holding on. But the psychological impact, the symbolic weight, and the quiet erosion of confidence had all reached a turning point. In the next chapter, we will explore the last flickering lights, the final century of the Western Empire. Puppet emperors, shrinking armies, fading cities, and a once mighty Senate losing influence, all while Rome's candle slowly dims but does not entirely vanish. After the sack of Rome in 410 CE, the Western Empire continued on, but it was no longer the same. The city still stood, still bustling in parts, still echoing with the whispers of centuries. But its light was dimmer now, not extinguished, not yet, but flickering. Imagine walking through Rome a few decades later. The marble streets are worn, some temples lie in partial ruin. The grand forums are quieter, the Senate still meets, but its voices lack the authority they once held. Rome had become a city of shadows and memory, a place where the past lingered like a comforting but melancholy song. And the people who lived there, they were doing their best to keep the music playing, even as the orchestra thinned. The empire itself had changed dramatically. Emperors came and went with alarming speed. Some were capable, others mere puppets. The army shrank. Mercenaries were common, often paid more for survival than loyalty. Frontiers that once seemed secure now struggled to repel wandering tribes. Citizens were tired. Farmers left fields untended. Merchants worried about trade routes disrupted by both nature and war. Cities outside Rome grew quieter, as provincial administrators became corrupt or indifferent. And yet, life went on. Rome, though smaller in spirit than in its glory days, was still Rome. The streets still carried laughter. Children still ran along the cobblestones, and candles burned at dusk in both homes and temples. The Senate, once the pinnacle of civic power, had become largely ceremonial. Its members argued, yes, and debated, yes, but their authority could not extend far beyond the palace gates. Decisions made there were often ignored or overruled by generals, emperors, or local leaders. The grand debates of Cicero's time had faded into quieter, sometimes desperate discussions about survival and resources. Even so, the Senate remained a symbol of continuity. a reminder that Rome's traditions endured even as the empire weakened. It was like an old lamp, still casting a warm glow in a large, drafty hall. Meanwhile, the army, once a proud force of citizen soldiers, was now a patchwork of professional troops and mercenaries. Discipline varied. Loyalty was often bought rather than earned, and when threats arose, whether from Vandals, Huns, or restless Germanic tribes, response was often slow and uneven. Yet soldiers marched on. They defended cities, patrolled borders, and sometimes fought bravely against impossible odds. Even in decline, Rome's military still inspired respect. It was smaller, yes, less organized, yes, but it endured. The provinces reflected a similar picture. Some areas thrived, some had been abandoned. Farmers worked fields where conditions allowed. Villages still existed, but often under local rulers rather than direct imperial authority. The Western Empire had become decentralized. Its vast, unified structure of the past now resembled a patchwork quilt, held together by habit, tradition, and faint loyalty. And yet, this decentralization did not mean chaos everywhere. Life continued, quietly, in ways that historians sometimes overlook. People married, had children, farmed, traded, prayed, and survived. In the background of decline, ordinary life still found its rhythm. Culturally, the West was changing too. Christianity now held deep sway. Churches became centers of community, learning, and refuge. Old temples and pagan traditions faded, but did not vanish entirely. Art, architecture, and literature continued, but often with smaller budgets and simpler audiences. Rome had shifted from empire to a network of communities trying to preserve its spirit. The grandeur was less monumental, yes, but the essence, the ideas, the values, the memory persisted even in decline. Rome's influence remained visible in law, language, and daily life. Economically, the empire was strained. Trade routes were disrupted by war, weather, and pirate raids. Famine and plagues had reduced population density, yet markets still existed. Bakers still baked, artisans still crafted goods. Gold and coins were rarer, but life adapted. The empire had learned resilience, not invincibility, not omnipotence, but resilience. And perhaps, in a quiet way, that was Rome's most enduring trait. The candle that was Rome flickered more with each passing decade. Emperors like Romulus, Augustulus, the so-called last emperor of the West, sat on thrones that were shadows of the palaces of Augustus and Hadrian. The army that surrounded him was thin. Cities around him were struggling. And yet, Rome's story was not yet finished, because even as the empire weakened, it left a legacy stronger than any army or treasury could provide. Its laws, infrastructure, language, and culture became the foundation for future European civilizations. Its roads connected regions for centuries to come. Its ideas of citizenship, governance, and civic duty outlived the political structures that created them. And so, as night falls over Rome in its final decades, we can picture a city of lights and shadows. Some candles are guttering, some flickering, some burning steady. Citizens walk the streets, perhaps unaware of the larger story of decline and transformation. Yet each flickering light tells a story of resilience, adaptation, survival, and quiet hope. Rome was fading. Yes, its political power dwindled, its armies thinned, its cities shrank, but its soul, that lingered, and even in the twilight, it offered warmth, guidance, and inspiration. By the end of this century, the Western Empire would be unrecognizable from its glory days. But the story of Rome was far from over. Its legacy would survive in law, language, faith, and architecture. Its influence would shape kingdoms, cities, and empires yet to come. Rome did not vanish like a candle snuffed out. It transformed. It left the Western world with the foundations upon which new civilizations would be built. And in this soft, quiet way, Rome endured. In the next chapter, we will reflect on what truly fell and what survived. Because the story of Rome is not just one of collapse. It is a story of transformation, continuity, and the quiet persistence of human endeavor. By now, we've walked through centuries of Rome's long twilight through overextended borders, faltering armies, plagues, famines, political chaos, and finally, the slow flicker of the Western Empire's lights. But here, in this quiet chapter, we pause, not for shock or sorrow, but for reflection. Rome, as a political and military entity, did indeed collapse. The Western Empire could no longer defend its lands, pay its soldiers, or maintain centralized authority. Cities shrank, emperors became figureheads, and the Senate's voice grew faint. The Visigoths and other migrating peoples moved through territories once tightly controlled, sometimes looting, sometimes settling. The empire had reached the limits of its endurance, and yet, as we saw in the last chapters, what truly fell was only one layer of Rome. Rome as an idea that never truly fell. Its laws survived. Roman law, carefully codified, persisted in courts, villages, and kingdoms that arose from the ruins. Principles of justice, contracts, citizenship, and property endured, forming the foundation for medieval and modern European legal systems. Even today, echoes of Roman legal thought ripple through our courts and constitutions. Its roads survived. Some crumbled with time, yes, but many remained the arteries connecting cities, villages, and trade networks for centuries. Merchants, pilgrims, armies, and travelers continued to rely on paths laid down by Romans long ago. In a quiet, literal sense, Rome's infrastructure carried the future forward, and its culture, language, literature, and art did not vanish. Latin evolved into Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian languages spoken by millions today. Roman architecture inspired generations of builders, from medieval cathedrals to Renaissance palaces. Even ideas of civic responsibility, citizenship, and public service remained alive in memory and in practice. Rome, in essence, transformed rather than disappeared. It became the skeleton upon which later civilizations could build. The West may have lost emperors, armies, and borders, but it inherited an enduring framework of knowledge, law, and culture. Religion, too, played a role in what survived. Christianity, now firmly established, became both a spiritual and social anchor for the former empire. Churches took on responsibilities once handled by imperial administrators, feeding the poor, organizing communities, and preserving texts. In monasteries and basilicas, knowledge was preserved, copied, and adapted for new generations. So in many ways, what seemed like an empire's spiritual shift in earlier centuries was also part of its survival. Rome as values and teachings living on through faith. Even its failures contributed to lessons for the future. Rome teaches us that empires are human creations. They can be magnificent, organized, and seemingly eternal, but they are also fragile, vulnerable to mismanagement, environmental change, and the quiet pressures of life. Overextension, economic imbalance, reliance on mercenary loyalty, climate shifts, plagues all. These combine to show that power alone cannot prevent decline. The Western Empire fell not in a day, not in a battle, but slowly, subtly, like a candle flickering in the wind. Yet from that decline came the wisdom, infrastructure, and cultural inheritance that shaped the medieval world and beyond. The Eastern Empire, of course, survived for centuries longer. Constantinople remained a hub of wealth, culture, and military strength. It preserved Roman governance, law, and tradition in new forms. While the West struggled, the East adapted, innovated, and endured. And when historians speak of Rome, they are often thinking of both West and East, not simply a city or an empire, but a network of ideas, traditions, and innovations. Even the memory of Rome itself became a tool for future rulers. Charlemagne, the popes, and other medieval kings invoked Rome's legacy to inspire loyalty, legitimize authority, and connect new kingdoms to an illustrious past. The empire may have fallen in administrative terms, but in imagination, it remained eternal. Stories, myths, and historical memory ensured that Rome's influence would outlast its political structures by centuries. And so, as we close this story, it is important to see Rome not as a tale of failure, but as a story of transformation. The Western Empire may have struggled, its armies thinned, and its cities dimmed, but the spirit of Rome, its laws, roads, language, culture, and ideas lived on, quietly, in the foundations of Europe and the world. Rome's fall was not a single event. It was a process, a slow unraveling intertwined with adaptation, survival, and transformation. And while candles flicker and wane, their light is not entirely lost. It warms, illuminates, and guides those who come after. In the end, perhaps Rome teaches us a simple truth. Great civilizations do not vanish entirely. They evolve. They leave legacies in unexpected places. In law, in language, in culture, in roads, and in ideas, Rome survives. And maybe that is the comforting lesson for history lovers, night owls, and dreamers alike. Even when the mighty fall, they leave something behind, something to learn from, something to inspire, something to build upon. So as we close the final chapter, we imagine a quiet night over the remnants of Rome, candles flickering in villas, lamps glowing in temples, fires burning in kitchens. People sleep, eat, dream, and live. The city may have changed, the empire may have faded, but life goes on. Rome, the eternal city, continues not in its armies, its borders, or its emperors, but in its enduring spirit. And that, perhaps, is the most remarkable legacy of all. With that, our journey through the hidden truth behind the fall of the Roman Empire comes to a calm, reflective close. Rome did not vanish, it transformed, leaving foundations for all that followed. Even after centuries, Rome leaves a quiet impression. Walk through its ruins today, and it feels like stepping into a city that is both ancient and alive. Broken columns lean slightly, yet still stand. Moss and ivy creep over marble. The echoes of footsteps long gone mingle with the rustling of modern leaves. For a city that once held the world's attention, the ruins seem humble now. But in humility lies a certain calm, a reminder that time moves on, and yet traces remain. It is easy to imagine a Roman citizen wandering these streets, a baker delivering bread to the forum, children playing along the aqueducts, soldiers marching to the beat of orders long forgotten. Some would marvel at the city's grandeur, others, perhaps worried about bills, taxes, or grain shipments. Even then, Rome was layered, majesty and worry, celebration and fear, power and fragility. Its ruins today echo that complexity. We see the monuments, the arches, the amphitheaters, but also the small homes, the modest shops, the roads that led nowhere eventually. Rome was never perfect. Its power was immense. Yes, its reach was remarkable, but it was also human. Standing among the ruins, we begin to notice patterns. Civilizations rise, shine, and fade. Power flows where resources allow, loyalty guides armies, and ideas endure longer than empires. Rome teaches us to observe quietly, to understand that collapse is rarely dramatic. It creeps, it murmurs, it seeps into the cracks until one day something has changed. And yet, even as the Western Empire's political and military structure fell, it leaves lessons that are surprisingly gentle. They whisper across centuries. Overextension is exhausting. Wealth without sustainability is fragile. Loyalty cannot be bought with coins alone. Nature is patient, but persistent. Change is inevitable, but transformation is possible. Look closer, and you notice that Rome's failures are as instructive as its triumphs. The empire spent centuries perfecting roads, aqueducts, laws, and military strategy. It built enormous monuments and governed millions. And yet, the smallest precious plague, famine, poorly timed reforms could weaken it. This teaches a kind of quiet humility. Even the greatest achievements require balance, care, and attention. Even the most magnificent cities cannot rely solely on reputation or past glory. Rome reminds us that history is cumulative, layered, and delicate. But perhaps the most remarkable lesson is in what survived. The ruins, for instance, are not empty. They are alive with memory. Every crumbled arch, every worn mosaic, every tilted column tells a story, not just of failure, but of endurance. Roman law survives in modern legal systems. Roman roads, though cracked or repurposed, guide trade routes today. Languages descended from Latin flourish. Christianity, architecture, literature, and civic ideals trace their roots back to this ancient empire. Even the ideas of citizenship, public responsibility, and governance have echoes in our modern world. Rome lives on, quietly, in ways we rarely notice in our everyday lives. We can also reflect on the human side of Rome. Imagine the faces behind the empire. Citizens, soldiers, farmers, priests, merchants. Some lived in luxury, some lived in struggle, some were ambitious, some were humble. They laughed, loved, argued, prayed, and grieved. And in doing so, they created a world that even in ruins resonates today. Their choices, successes, and mistakes echo across centuries. It is oddly comforting to remember this. Rome's greatness was not only in its walls and armies, but in the quiet persistence of its people. Ordinary life, lived day by day, mattered. And it still matters when we reflect on history. Even nature participates in these reflections. Vines creep over columns. Trees grow from shattered stone. Birds nest in arches that once rang with human activity. Rain and wind slowly erase some traces, but in doing so, they also preserve others, moss highlighting a carved letter, soil protecting a mosaic beneath. Rome becomes a dialogue between human endeavor and the natural world. It is a reminder that no empire exists entirely separate from its environment. Climate, geography, and natural forces shaped Rome's rise and contributed to its quiet decline. And yet, nature also helps us remember and honor what endured. Visiting the ruins, or even imagining them, we find a meditative rhythm. Step by step, column by column, history unfolds gently. It is not a story of instantaneous collapse or dramatic catastrophe. It is a story of small shifts, cumulative pressures, quiet failures, and persistent resilience. Even the city's destruction, the sacking, the abandoned neighborhoods, the political decay carries a calm lesson. Decline is often gradual, subtle, and human. And when we look closely, we see how much survived anyway. Perhaps, as we close this chapter in our minds, we notice the soft continuity. Rome's ideas, roads, art, and culture continue in ways we might not expect. Rome's influence stretches into modern law, language, architecture, and governance. Its spiritual and cultural legacy continues to shape communities around the world. Rome fell as an empire but survived as a foundation. Its stones crumble, yes, but its light remains, flickering gently through centuries. And as with any candle, even a flicker can guide, inspire, and warm those who come after. So when we walk among the ruins, or close our eyes to imagine them, we see something profound. Rome teaches patience, humility, and endurance. Rome shows that even when structures fail, ideas endure. Rome reminds us that transformation can follow decline. In the quiet reflection of broken columns and empty forums, we understand something soft and enduring. Great civilizations do not vanish completely. They transform. They live on quietly, like embers glowing beneath ash. Rome, in its final century, may have flickered, but it never truly went out. Its roads still guide, its laws still govern, its language still communicates, and its spirit quietly whispers across time. And perhaps that is the most comforting lesson of all. Even as the mighty fall, something of their light survives. It becomes the foundation for new stories, new cities, and new dreams. Rome endures not as a perfect empire, but as a quiet, eternal presence in the human story. And now, as the story of Rome's rise, struggles, and transformation draws to a close, we slow down. We let the city's streets fade into soft shadows. We let the echoes of marble forums, bustling markets, and marching soldiers gently settle. Rome, after all, is more than bricks, roads, and monuments. It is a feeling, a legacy, a story whispered across centuries. And like all great stories, it deserves a quiet ending, a chance to breathe, reflect, and rest. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine the city one last time in its twilight. The sun sets over the Tiber, bathing the city in gold and pink light. A few candles flicker in villa windows. Children's laughter carries softly through quiet streets. A dog trots along the worn cobblestones. The air smells faintly of bread, herbs, and distant incense. This is Rome after the emperors, after armies, after plagues. It is a city in transition, a city that has experienced triumph and tragedy, glory and decline. Yet it remains alive, not in conquest, not in empire, but in memory, influence, and enduring spirit. The fall of the Western Empire, while dramatic in hindsight, was not a sudden collapse. It was a gentle, persistent unraveling, like mist lifting from the mountains at dawn. Borders became harder to defend. Armies grew thin, economies struggled, and citizens, like soft flames flickering in the wind, adapted to each change as best they could. But this is not a story of despair. It is a story of resilience, of human ingenuity, of lessons learned quietly in the ruins, the streets, and the hearts of those who lived and who dreamed within Rome. As we walk through the centuries in our imagination, we see what truly survived. The roads connecting villages, towns, and cities, guiding travelers for centuries. The legal systems that shaped justice long after emperors faded. The language that evolved into new tongues, still spoken today. The art, literature, and architecture inspiring generations. The faith, rituals, and community structures that preserved knowledge, hope, and values. Rome's fall, then, was not an erasure. It was a transformation, a quiet passing of one form of greatness into another. The empire's heart slowed, yes, but its ideas, its structure, and its spirit continued to pulse softly, invisibly, across time. And in this reflection, we notice something comforting. The city we imagine is not empty. It is full of life, even in ruins. Not life of conquest or power, but life of endurance. People still live, create, learn, and dream. The past and present mingle gently, like sunlight and shadow over ancient stones. Even the mistakes, the failures, and the decline carry lessons. They teach patience, humility, and awareness. They show that no matter how mighty we are subject to time, nature, and circumstance. And yet, human creativity, adaptation, and resilience can endure beyond the rise and fall of any empire. Imagine the soft sounds of the city at night, the quiet lapping of the Tiber, the distant murmur of a night watchman, the creak of wooden shutters, the sigh of wind through partially crumbled arches. All of these small details remind us that life continues. History is not only made of battles, decrees, or plagues. It is made of ordinary moments. A baker kneading dough, a child running through a sunlit forum, a family sharing a meal in a modest home. These moments, fleeting as they may seem, are what persist. They are the threads connecting past and present, and they are the quiet essence of Rome's enduring story. We can also reflect on the idea of time itself. Empires rise, civilizations change, and cities transform. And yet, ideas, culture, and human spirit have a way of surviving beyond walls, armies, and political power. Rome teaches us this gently, patiently. Even when doors are closed, gates fall, or armies retreat, there is continuity. Even in shadow, light persists. Even in decline, inspiration remains. So as we prepare to leave this imagined Rome, we can do so with a sense of calm. We are not witnessing catastrophe. We are witnessing transformation. We are not seeing only endings. We are seeing evolution, quiet endurance, and the persistence of human endeavor across centuries. Rome is no longer the bustling capital of a vast empire. It is no longer a city ruled by emperors or legions, but it is alive in law, language, art, faith, and memory. It whispers across time, soft but persistent, reminding us that even when greatness changes form, it is not lost. As our journey ends, imagine one final evening over the Tiber. The sun dips behind distant hills. A soft breeze carries the scent of herbs and bread. A lantern glows in a quiet villa. A scholar copies texts in a candlelit room. A child dreams beneath an open window. This is Rome after Rome, not in its political power, not in its armies, not in its walls, but in its enduring spirit, gently shaping the world in ways invisible but undeniable. And with that, we close the story. The fall of the Western Roman Empire is no longer a tale of fear or loss. It is a tale of quiet transformation, resilience, and the eternal echo of human creativity. Rome did not vanish. It transformed. Its light, like a soft candle, continues to flicker through history, guiding, inspiring, and reminding us that even in endings, something enduring remains. Sleep now, with the soft assurance that stories, like empires, may change shape, but they never entirely disappear. Rome's story and the lessons it carries will live on quietly in the hearts and minds of dreamers, past, present, and future.